Hi everyone, my name's Aaron, and today I'm going to show you how to make a simple bread that, with a small handful of ingredients, you can make at home. Before we begin actually cooking with these ingredients, the first thing I want to talk about is how to make sure that your kitchen is in the best situation for making a good bread. Bread is not just a product of the ingredients that you put in. Bread is a product of the environment in which you cook it. So ideally, you actually want bread to rise in a temperature of about 80 degrees. Now, most people don't keep their homes or their kitchens at 80 degrees. In fact, today I think it's about 67 in my kitchen, and we have decent weather, so it's a comfortable humidity, which is also important. If it's too humid or too dry, your bread is going to be either too wet or not wet enough, and you'll have to adjust the ingredients accordingly. And I'll show you what I mean by that later. But in order to create a better environment for the bread to work, I actually like to start preheating my oven to the recommended 375 degrees before I even start mixing the ingredients together, and that'll give the room a chance to warm up a bit without having to turn up the heat in the entire place. Let's start by looking at our ingredients. I have pre-measured 3 cups of flour, and we have 2 cups of warm water, 3 tablespoons of brown sugar, although any sugar will work. So if you only have white granulated sugar, that's fine. Just 3 tablespoons of that. 2 tablespoons of, in this case, it's olive oil, but any sort of vegetable oil or even a softened butter or margarine will work. Although I would suggest using vegetable oil or olive oil since it has a low water content. A tablespoon of salt, and an extra quarter of a cup of water that we are going to mix our yeast into. So let's start with the yeast. Now, the water in this cup, there's about a quarter of a cup of water in there, and it is, well, this one's gotten a little bit cold, but that's okay. But you probably want to run the tap in your kitchen until it feels warm to the touch. And then you're going to want to, now, this is a jar of active dry yeast. Most yeast is on the market is either active dry, or instant yeast. Any of those will pretty much work for making bread, but active dry is the preferable yeast for this purpose. So you're going to want to take 2 1/4 tablespoons. Not tablespoons, sorry, 2 1/4 teaspoons. And you'll take those 2 1/4 teaspoons and just put it in the water and just wait. And in about 10 minutes, that should foam up a little bit. And that lets you know the yeast is alive and will actually work for purposes of making bread. If the yeast doesn't foam up after about 10 minutes, your yeast is probably dead and it's not going to work. You will need to get different yeast. This type of yeast also comes in packets. All right, so you can see that this yeast is active. There's bubbles along the side of the bowl. There's pretty good blossoming of little yeast colonies in there. So this yeast is good, and I will be using it for the recipe. This step is really only to check whether or not the yeast works. It doesn't really do anything that changes the outcome of the bread, other than if your yeast doesn't work, your bread's not going to work. And if you still, as long as you see the bubbles and some frothiness, you know the yeast is good. If some of the yeast remains undissolved, floating on the top, that's fine. You could actually just pour the yeast dry into the bread, and as long as it is good yeast, it will still make the bread rise. This is really just to check it. So we're going to set this aside for a moment and turn to our sort of main ingredients here. So I've said I have 3 cups of flour in this batter bowl, to which I am going to add a tablespoon of salt. Now there's a little lump of salt in there. If your salt, for whatever reason, is lumpy, just pinch it until it goes back into being granules. We have 3 tablespoons of brown sugar, but use any sugar that you have. Doesn't have to be brown sugar, and white sugar works just as well. In fact, you can use pretty much any sugar, molasses, anything like that if you want. It will change the flavor of the bread, but that is simply a matter of preference. And I'm going to pour in our yeast mixture. Just swirl it around a little bit to get as much yeast as possible in. And then add in the 3 tablespoons of oil and 2 cups of water. Now, here, we start stirring this in this bowl, and you're going to want to stir it until the dough comes together and becomes a solid mass. And here's where you may need to, in fact, you probably will need to add more flour. But the reason that we don't start with, say, 6 cups of flour, even though you may end up putting that much in, is because this is where the environmental conditions in your kitchen are going to affect what you need to put into the bowl. So I put in 3 cups of flour. I know that that's not likely to be enough, but I will see in a moment how far that gets me. So I will show you in a second what to do about adding more flour. All right, so I've mixed the dough with the ingredients that we started with. As you can see, it's sort of a little bit thicker maybe than a pancake batter. So that's obviously not thick enough. So I'm going to use some flour, and I think this can certainly accommodate another cup of flour at least. So I'm going to start with an additional cup of flour. I like to measure fairly carefully during this, but it is sort of a qualitative more than quantitative step. So add it in a little bit at a time. This both gives you more control over the consistency of the batter, and frankly, it's just easier to mix a small amount in as opposed to a large amount. So I'll show you what it looks like after I'm done mixing this in. So after that first addition of flour, you can see it's now much more similar to a bread dough consistency, but it's still a little bit loose. This would be hard to work with, particularly if you are new to working with dough, and it can still accommodate some more flour. So I'm going to put in the remainder of this cup. We'll mix that in, and then I'll show you where it's at. All right, so now we've got much thicker dough that's really starting to hold together and act more like a bread dough. So at this point, I'm actually going to get rid of the spatula, and I am going to add a little bit more flour in, but I'm actually going to start mixing this by hand, in part because I can flour my hands and keep the dough from sticking to them. And flouring your hand, I find the easiest way is just grab a pinch of flour out of the bag, rub it around on your hand so it's lightly powdered, and then you can pretty much reach into the dough and nothing particularly is going to stick. Even if I get down to the bottom where it's wet, it'll come off pretty easily. So I'm going to mix this in by hand, and then from there we'll probably be ready to turn this dough out and start kneading it, and if it needs more flour, we can mix that in the kneading process. So I'm going to just mix this, and I will come back to you when it is mixed. All right, so I've mixed the dough by hand in the bowl, and I've turned it out onto my counter. Now, a lot of recipes will say to lightly flour the surface that you turn the dough out onto, but when you add flour to flour the surface, you're ultimately adding that flour to your dough, and the dough can get pretty tight, meaning that the yeast is going to have a harder time working and creating what we call a gluten lattice, which is the technical term for the what you like about bread, the sponginess and the texture. So what I like to do is mix it until there's a little bit of flour left unmixed in the bowl, and then turn it out that way so that flour is also working to flour the work surface. And if we need to add more flour because it's the dough is too loose or it's hard to knead, we can do that as needed later on. So for right now, I'm actually going to divide this ball of dough into two, because I'm going to show you another way of kneading dough that requires a little bit more special equipment, but is a lot easier if that's your preference. So I'll show you in a moment how to knead this, and then I'll show you later how to knead it using a food processor. All right, so here's our remaining half of the dough, and as you can see, it's pretty shaggy and little pieces of it will flake off as we work with it. Just keep pushing those back into the center and remixing them into the dough. Now, because I'm holding the phone to record this, I'm going to show you sort of one-handed some kneading technique here, but basically for kneading, you kind of want to just be folding the dough and pressing it. Now, the harder you do this and the more you work it, the stronger the gluten lattice that you build is. If you put this into the oven right now, there's not much there for the yeast to, the carbon dioxide the yeast is producing to get caught in, and the bread really wouldn't rise particularly well. It would stay kind of squishy and gross. But if you work it, flatten it out, keep flattening it, keep folding it in on itself and flattening, in time, the gluten will start to attach to other gluten and build the lattice that we need. Now this is still a little bit too sticky, so I'm going to reach into my bag of flour, just flour my hand a little bit, and pat the dough down a little bit with that. Again, you don't want to get it too stiff at first, because as you work the dough, it's going to hold together better. So you just keep working it. Usually, if you're kneading something by hand, you're going to knead it somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, depending on how hard you knead it, how effective the kneading is, how wet the environment is, and how much flour you've put in it. I'm going to do a little bit more flour on this, and oops. So again, just folding it and pressing. That's really the primary motion of kneading. Fold and press, fold and press. And obviously, if you're not holding a phone, you can use both hands. That'll make it easier. It'll go faster, and you can pretty much apply force to the bread in any way. You can hit it against the surface. You can stretch it out and squish it. But really what you want to do is apply force to the flour so that it binds the proteins together. So I'm going to knead it a little bit more, and then I'll show you what it looks like, and then we'll go from there. All right, so I've been kneading this dough for about 5 minutes since I last talked to you, and as you can see, it's now starting to become a little bit stiffer. It's not sticking to the surface quite as readily. It is still a little sticky. We want that. You don't want the dough to be so stiff that it can't rise, but it's starting to come together. So I'm going to demonstrate a little bit, now that it's a little less gooey, just some of the kneading techniques, so you can see how to do them, but you can do them right from the beginning. You don't have to wait until the dough is at this stage. Like I said, my favorite is really to fold and press. You can do that as many times as you want until the bread really comes together. I do like to take the dough off the surface and bring it back down forcefully in between kneading. It seems to help. It adds quick movement to each press, and that extra energy builds up over time to bring the dough together. You can roll it long like that, fold it in from both ends, just roll it on the counter a little bit, pick it up, put it back down, and do it again. If you just do that, this will come together. The nice thing about hand kneading bread is you really can't screw it up as long as you do it enough. It's almost impossible to over knead bread by hand. You're not fast or strong enough to do that, more than likely. I think probably very few people outside of power lifters could really screw up kneading bread by hand by doing it too much. You can definitely screw it up by doing it too little. So this bread, this dough actually, even though it looks pretty good, it's maybe still a little bit stickier than I would want to have it rise. So I'm just going to keep working it probably for another 5 minutes or so, and then I'll show you what it looks like, and it'll probably be ready to prove. All right, so it's been about another 5 minutes of kneading. As you can see, the dough is now a ball unto itself. It no longer looks shaggy. It's got a sort of slightly shiny appearance on the outside of the dough. It is sufficiently elastic. It feels soft to the touch. It's pliable, but it comes away from the work surface and my hands. You can actually see it's taken pretty much all of the flour and other gunk that built up in the early parts of kneading back off of my hands. So it's, it can take a shape and hold it a little bit, and that's what you want to see. You don't want it so stodgy that it doesn't bounce back, but you also don't want it to be so stiff that you can't punch into it either. So this piece of dough is actually ready, and I'm going to set it aside to rest while I demonstrate what to do if you want to make this in the food processor, but that is not a normal part of making dough, and you wouldn't need to normally set it aside to rest. You would put it straight through to proving, which is really just resting in a bowl. So I'll explain that a little bit after I show you how to knead dough in a food processor. So I took this dough out of the food processor. It's not quite where I want it to be yet, but I am worried that continuing to process it by machine might overwork it. So I'm going to finish this by just kneading it a little bit by hand for 2 or 3 minutes, and then it should be ready to rise as well. And I'll show you how to do that. So like I said, just folding and pressing the dough. And I'll do that for a few more minutes and then show you how to set the dough to rise. So I have finished just kneading out the last couple of issues in the dough from the food processor, and I've actually folded the hand kneaded dough and the machine kneaded dough back into each other to create one big dough ball here. Obviously, you would not need to do that, since it seems incredibly unlikely that you would use 2 different kneading methods for the same dough. Normally, you don't divide the dough up. You would just knead it all together one way or the other. But if you are using a food processor or machine, you may need to divide it into smaller portions to fit into the machine. But if you're doing it by hand, you do it all as one thing. And I'll explain later why I strongly recommend kneading dough by hand, especially if you are new to making bread. But for now, we're going to take this we're going to put it into our 2-quart batter bowl, which I'm going to lightly grease with a little bit of olive oil. The batter bowl, this is the same one I used earlier to mix the ingredients. It is important that you not leave any excess ingredients, particularly flour, salt, or water, inside the bowl. That will change the humidity and pH of your dough, which will change how the yeast works in the next process of making it rise. So just lightly grease the inside of the bowl. This is really just so that when the dough expands and hits the edge of the bowl, it doesn't stick, and you don't have to tear apart the gluten lattice to get the dough out. You can put any sort of excess oil on the outside of the dough that will help stop it from drying out. Take it off of your work surface, form it into a ball, place it into the bowl, and then turn it so that the greased side is up. Now, at this point, this bowl actually has its own cover that fits very snugly on the top. So I'm going to be using that, but you could use either a piece of saran wrap or a shower cap or anything that will really just stop air getting into your dough and interfering with the yeast. And then I'm going to put a cloth over it just to insulate it so that it doesn't lose any heat. We're using this lovely jack-o'-lantern towel. And now the best place in my kitchen to let dough rise is actually in the middle of the stove or on any of the front burners, which are relatively warm while the oven is preheating, but not so hot that it will kill the yeast, which is very important. In fact, I'm going to put it right here on this burner. That should keep this dough in approximately 80 degrees, which is what you want for it to rise. Now, most ovens, including this one, do have a tray at the bottom. You can see it down here. Most of us keep pans and stuff in there, but it is technically a tray for putting dough in to rise. I do not have a batter bowl that fits in that tray, but I may use it later when we put these into loaf pans, because they do fit in there, and it maintains a almost perfect temperature for dough. So this dough is going to need to rise somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours. But if you want to make sure that you don't overprove it, watch to see when the dough about doubles in size. And that is going to be when you want to move on to the next step, and I will join you then. While the bread is rising, I did want to talk briefly about the different methods of mixing and kneading the dough. So today I showed you how to do it by hand, mixing it with rubber batter scoop in a 2-quart batter bowl, and also showed you kneading both by hand and kneading in the food processor. You can technically mix bread in the food processor by putting in the raw ingredients. However, as you saw, the food processor can be a mechanically finicky item in the kitchen. It definitely does not have an infinite capacity as far as volume is concerned, and you might end up having to work in much smaller batches, which means that your ingredients could end up mixing unevenly if you get more flour in the first quarter of it and more water in the last, and that could create problems. Additionally, especially if you are a beginner and you don't have a good feel for the needed ratio of ingredients based on the humidity and temperature of your kitchen, the food processor will not tell you if you got it wrong. And you can end up mixing the dough all the way through from raw ingredients straight through fully kneaded, and then find out your dough is either too stiff or too loose. And you can fix too loose, just put more flour in, but fixing too stiff can be difficult because you can reach the point where the dough is no longer workable and your gluten lattice is just whatever it's going to be, and you're risking breaking it by continuing to work it more. For these reasons, I strongly recommend that beginner cooks always mix bread by hand and always knead it by hand, because you're going to get a sense of what bread feels like, and if you are scientific about it and you note the temperature and relative humidity, or at least how it feels when you're working on bread under different conditions, you will get a sense that would allow you to then use a mechanical process later. But if you are devoted to the idea of labor-saving kitchen devices and you do not want to knead bread by hand, there is one item that does provide a sort of best of both worlds solution, and that is a stand mixer with a dough hook attachment. Now, stand mixers are incredibly expensive. If you don't already own one and you really just want to make a loaf of bread, do not go out and buy a stand mixer for that purpose. It would be a huge waste of money. But if you have a stand mixer or you know somebody who does, stand mixers allow you to see what's going on in them. You have much more control over the intensity of the mechanical action, and you can stop the mixer, reach in and touch the dough without a lot of rigmarole and get a better sense of how the dough is coming along, unlike the food processor, which you basically have to take apart every time you want to do that. Stand mixers also have a lot greater capacity for volume, so you'll likely be able to mix your entire recipe in one batch as opposed to having to divide it up and risk an uneven mixture. So if you really want a mechanical solution to the issue of kneading, a stand mixer is the way to go. Obviously, if you just want to throw things in and make sure that there's bread at the end of it, there's the bread machine, but again, that is a single-use item and relatively expensive when bread is not, frankly, that hard to make by hand. But if you really need a set-it-and-forget-it way, there is the bread machine, but I would recommend either doing it by hand or using a stand mixer. So now the dough should be appropriately risen. This one has actually popped out a little bit. That's not great. Ideally, it would not do that. Now, because I have used active dry yeast and not instant yeast, this probably isn't the end of the world. Usually active dry yeast gets a couple of rises out of it. But anyway, punch the dough down and pull it away from the edges of the bowl, but try not to tear it. In the meantime, you're going to want to prepare a couple of bread pans. Now, I have two different ones here. I have a standard metal nonstick bread pan that you can get pretty much anywhere, and then I also have a stoneware bread pan. But prepping them is about the same either way. Just take a little bit of olive oil and just rub the inside of the pan with the olive oil so the bread doesn't stick to the pan while it's baking. And then you're going to divide the bread in half and put a half in each pan in a rough loaf shape. And then we're going to set the bread to rise a second time. And the second rising is really important because otherwise it would just bake into a brick, and that's not what you want. So I'm going to prep these pans, and I'll show you how to put the dough into the pans. All right, so you can see I've taken half of the dough, and I've put it into the bottom of the first loaf pan to sort of press it into a rough bread loaf shape. Pan's going to do most of the work in that respect, to be honest, so as long as you don't squish it all up into one end, you should be okay. I'll show you with the other half. Just put it into there, press it into the bottom, and press the edges a little bit. Just form it into, like I said, a rough loaf shape in your pan, and that should be good. Then you're going to set these to rise. You're going to do basically the same thing that you did before. Either put saran wrap or wax paper over the top, and then put a towel over that and keep it in a warm place. This is a great time to use the proving drawer under your oven if it's not full of stuff. But either way, this time you're going to want to let it rise for about 45 minutes to an hour. Again, you want it to about double in size. You don't want it to spill over, and it's much more important at this stage that the rising be well regulated, because if it gets too puffed up at this point, you may not be able to save the dough. And you can end up with bread that's either mostly air or collapses in the oven, and neither of those are good. So keep an eye on it, but it should be about 45 minutes to an hour before it doubles in size again. And if you're using, like I said, if you used active dry yeast and it does over-rise, you can usually punch active dry yeast bread doughs back down a couple of times and they'll come back. If you're using instant yeast and you have over-risen the bread, unfortunately, there's a good chance your bread's not going to work. For that reason, I strongly recommend that you use active dry yeast and not instant. So we'll come back when these have risen. So as you can see, these loaves of bread have about doubled in size in the pan, which means they are ready to go into the oven. I preheated the oven early on to maintain an ideal circumstance for bread rising. And so at this point, I'm just going to pop these in the oven for about 30 minutes at 375 degrees. And when they come out, they should be about ready. You want the bread to be golden brown on the outside and sound hollow when struck. That's how you know it'll be done. And I'll show you what that is like once it's done. So I'm going to put these in the oven. And it's important that the oven rack that you put them on be approximately in the middle of your oven. You don't want the bottom or the top to cook faster than the rest. So that's just a quick note on that, and I'll be back with you in about a half an hour to 35 minutes. All right, so it's been half an hour since I put these in. It looks like they are definitely golden brown, and if you tap on it, sounds hollow and solid. You don't want to leave it in too long. You also don't want to cut into it while it's this hot. Some of the baking process is still going on internally. So if you cut into it too early, you release the trapped hot gases that may still be solidifying some of the stuff in the middle. So at this point, I usually just let them cool a little bit just on the stove in the pans, and then I would turn them out onto a plate or a cooling rack and let them cool completely before you cut into them. So that's how you make bread, and I'll show you what it looks like when they're cool, and I'll cut a slice for you. So here's one of our finished loaves, and I'm just going to cut it in half, use a good sharp bread knife, and show you what it looks like on the inside. So here's the inside of our bread. You can see it's got normal bread consistency, nice little pockets of air in between the bread particles. It's nice and soft. It gives, but it doesn't completely collapse when you press it. So this is what you want bread to look like. And that's it. That's making bread. You can do it. You have all the skills you need, probably have everything you need in your kitchen. If not, as you've seen, there's nothing terribly exotic about it. So go out and do it. So thanks for joining me and watching this video. I hope you found it informative or enjoyable or whatever you were looking for. I made this video because, like many of you, I'm stuck inside indefinitely. Needed something to do. So, this is something I'm hoping you'll find helpful, especially if you've been worried about being able to get supplies. Knowing how to make your own, I hope would alleviate some of that fear. And if nothing more, it can be a fun hobby until we can all get back to our normal lives. So until then, stay safe, stay well, and enjoy.